Sure, I'll see. I'll let it happen. I have one daughter, 3
All right, guys. I'm going to pass this sign-in sheet around and give us your name, email, phone number, that kind of thing. In the last column, it says recovery coach. So we can talk about that for a minute. Favor takes folks that have gone through this as family members and trains them and certifies them through our Recovery Coach Academy. Technically my Recovery Coach Academy, because you have to be a clinician to get this academy, but it's through the National Association of Alcohol and Drug Abuse Counselors. So we have an educational provider number. We certify you as a family recovery coach, certify a person as a family recovery coach. We probably have about 13 active family coaches right now. And they can talk to you one-on-one about your situation and give you real practical advice related to what you're dealing with. They don't have necessarily magic answers. You guys know this. But they can, if you have specific questions or if you just want someone to listen. If you're interested in that, check this box on this sheet. And I'm doing another training on Thursday of this week. And I hope, one of the things that we hope to take a look at as an organization is whether or not we can get in the intervention game. Interventions are, first of all, we want to be selective on who can do interventions. Not everyone can do an intervention. Everyone can try to do an intervention, but you got to do them right or they can go wrong. They can go badly. But they're very, very time consuming and they're pretty staff intensive. So we don't really have an active intervention program going right now. We would farm those out if people were looking for interventions. You guys know what I mean by an intervention? We don't do them the way you see on TV. That show A&E Intervention is awful. It's horrible. Completely inappropriate. It exploits people who are in addiction and follows them around with a camera, and then they conduct an intervention that is just precisely intense enough, right? But it always works out in the end. I'm here to tell you, as somebody who's done about 200 of these things, that's not how it goes. Most of the time when you do an intervention, it's actually the person goes with a whimper. It's not dramatic enough for TV. Occasionally it gets out of control.
It's a Hallmark intervention.
It's not quite a Hallmark intervention. It'd be like the PG-13 version of Hallmark. All right, so tonight we're going to talk about, we'll go through a little bit of the basics because we're going to do that every week. In case there are new folks here, we'll kind of go through it a little bit quicker tonight. Had one question from somebody who wanted to talk about co-occurring disorders, and so I'm going to talk about that as well. Co-occurring disorders, technically, if a person has a mental health diagnosis and a substance use disorder diagnosis, they fall into this category of co-occurring disorders. Used to be called dual diagnosis. Anybody hear that before? And sometimes people get confused on what should we be working on? Should the person be working on drug and alcohol counseling? Should they be working on drug and alcohol treatment? Or should they be working on mental health? I'll go through this in a little more detail, but the short answer to that question is they should be working on, as much as possible, both at one time. That make sense? And then I'll go through and talk a little bit about stress management and things like that. I guess let's start off talking about co-occurring disorders and go through that a little bit and kind of try to get both of us, get everyone on the same page. So let me shut this one down and we'll pull up the co-occurring disorder. Let's go over here. Okay. All right, let's try this one. All right. All right. I think we talked about this in here before. This is technically the manual that gives you a diagnosis. If you've ever been to treatment, if you've ever been to a counselor and you used your insurance, this is what they use to diagnose you. There are 300 plus diagnoses in there. I've said this in here before. I guarantee I could find one on you if you gave me a minute. Okay? Everything is a disorder today. Being alive is a disorder. Life is a chronic and fatal disease. And we're all going to wind up dying at some point in time. But it's everything from a lot of things that you guys have heard of, like ADHD. Everybody's heard of ADHD. How about depression? Everybody's heard of depression. Anxiety disorders, post-traumatic, ranging from there to things like, relatively exotic eating disorders, other things like adjustment disorder, which is just a diagnosis whenever you've had a bad thing happen and you're having trouble getting through it. So a lot of different diagnoses in the DSM. And this is where this term comes from, or where this process comes from. If your loved one has ever been on any kind of medication, let me take that back. So one of the tricky things we have going on today's world is general practitioners are prescribing psychiatric meds, right? Most people who are on antidepressants, for example, got them from their GP. And that's a little bit different. That's a little bit strange. I'm not saying I think that should go away. I understand why that's there, but that's not necessarily how it's supposed to go down, right? Because I'm sure when you go see your general practitioner and you say, I'm depressed, I'm feeling bad, he puts you on Prozac or he puts you on Celexa or whatever it may be, he doesn't necessarily go through a thorough psychiatric history at that point. I don't think it goes down like that. So this should happen following a thorough psychiatric history. Let's camp out here for a minute and make sure we're all clear on this. If you're wondering what's going on with your loved one, and you've heard they've said I'm dealing with depression or I'm dealing with anxiety, the first place to start is get them actually evaluated. Evaluated by a psychiatrist, evaluated by a mental health counselor. A general practitioner really can't make that call. Yes?
One thing that happened to us is, so my son had the addiction issue, went to rehabs and all that, and then when he came back here, we were trying to he went to his regular general doctor. We had to go to another doctor to be put on Subzol, which is like Suboxone. But we wanted to get him a psychiatrist and a therapist. And we run into big time trouble here trying to find a psychiatrist in Greenville that would even take him because of the substance abuse issue.
Yeah, I know. And this is part of the problem. This is, one of the issues. I sit here and tell you, get a psychiatrist to evaluate him, and it's incredibly hard to find a psychiatrist that's going to evaluate him. It's really hard to find a psychiatrist that'll take the time to do a thorough evaluation.
Right, that's what we run into.
So,
You don't have a name then?
what's that?
Do you have a name of one?
I don't have a name. A lot of the psychiatrists, does anyone have a name they would want to share? Yes, sir.
Mary Ladd is fairly.
Yeah, she's full.
She's full already?
But Mary Ladd is a fantastic psychiatrist who will do a thorough evaluation. If you were to Google that, though, you want to Google Jeff Stevens Psychiatry. She's part of Jeff Stevens. And you can certainly drop my name when you call her. But they get full. like any other therapist gets full, like any other doctor's office gets full. We have a list under resources on our website. But that doesn't mean that those folks are going to do a thorough assessment. But those are people that at the very least we've worked with in one capacity or another, and we haven't had a terrible experience.
What's your name on the waiting list? Nothing else. I mean, just because they hold doesn't mean anything.
And you also get to a point where you start to wonder, you start to learn about this yourself, because remember, I've been saying it here all along, it's almost like family members need to become subject matter experts in this area because of the reality of the system and the reality of what we're dealing with. You guys get that? You kind of have to, you're not going to diagnose your loved one, not at all. For goodness sake, do not do that. You know, don't go home tonight and be like, Rich said, let me get the DSM out, let's figure out what you're dealing with. But you want to become aware of what it is and what it looks like and what the categories are, and a way of thinking about it for yourself, because you're probably going to have to negotiate that process. And maybe some people would say, Rich, that's the way it is with all healthcare now. You kind of have to take the lead in your own healthcare and be a very active patient when you're dealing with whatever you're dealing with. Were you going to say something, ma'am?
Get familiar with NAMI and the resources that they have. They offer classes and stuff.
So you can look for resources like the National Alliance for Mental Illness, that's NAMI. You can go online and you can start to learn about this. And you can try to find and access psychiatrist or therapist, individual therapist that might help guide you through this process. So, everyone got that? I've gone, yes.
How do you talk your loved one into going?
I'm going to talk about that as soon as I get done with this. Our question was, that's fine and dandy, but what do we do if they won't go? Which is not an uncommon occurrence, not uncommon. So this is sort of how do you pick out where they should go. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about what you can do to try to get them to go. We've talked about this. These are the criteria for substance use disorder. And if you get 6 of those 11, you meet the criteria for substance use disorder severe. And I think everyone in here has been to this group before, therefore you know and understand what happens over time. Depletion of dopamine becomes a completely irrational issue. It's no longer a person just having some fun. It's as if the brain has been sucked out and another brain has been put back in there, and it just used despite their own best interests. Everyone got that? It's the thing that'll make you scratch your head, and it's one of the reasons why you don't want to try to just talk people out of it. You don't want to try to debate your way through a person's addiction, because it's not coming from a rational place. And this is the picture of the brain that shows the depletion of dopamine. Okay? On my right is a normal, on your right is a normal brain. On my left is a depletion of dopamine. But we make a comeback over time, and I'm in recovery 19 years, so clearly my dopamine is just firing like it should be, like a fine oiled machine. Somewhat of a joke, I don't know, maybe. I've never gotten this done to me. I mean, I should go get this checked out and see what this is like. These are very expensive procedures. All right, so, why do we want to talk about co-occurring disorders? First of all, we have to acknowledge, even though tongue-in-cheek we talk about the DSM and we say things like, well, there's a diagnosis for every disorder, we got to get real that things like depression are real, right? You do not have to be addicted to anything to suffer from depression. Depression is a real disorder. Generalized anxiety disorder is a real disorder. ADHD, for that matter, is a real disorder. Now, people can say it's overdiagnosed and the pharmaceutical companies have pushed it too much. That's maybe a debate for another time, and I don't know that I would completely disagree with that. But regardless of whether that's the case or not, people suffer from this independent of addiction. And people who have dealt with addiction suffer from this at about 50 to 60% more prevalence rate. So it's not uncommon for folks who come into favor to be dealing with co-occurring anxiety and co-occurring depression. Those would be the two that we see more than anything. Hands down. Probably after that would be trauma. Those are the issues. And the other ones you hear of, guys, more than anything, the next one will be bipolar. And then you might get into some of the psychotic disorders, but really it doesn't go much deeper than that here, because why? We are primarily a drug and alcohol program. So a lot of those folks are probably showing up other places. So how do we want to think about this? There's different ways to think about co-occurring disorders. And this is all kind of open to debate. This is, we're entering an era where they're finally studying the human brain as it relates to substance use disorder and mental health. The decade of the 2000s, literally in my world, in the psychology world, it was named the decade of the brain. Before that, everything was theoretical. Does that make sense? So think about how people help people from the beginning of time. It's not like human beings were the only ones that have ever experienced problems. The first precursor to psychiatrists or psychologists would have been things like philosophers. Like the Stoic philosophers, for example, Marcus Aurelius and Seneca, and these people, they basically used cognitive behavioral therapy to help people deal with everyday problems, and they wrote books about it. Then psychology came on board, theology came on board. This is how we kind of explain problems away. Sigmund Freud kind of introduces us to psychotherapy. That dude was a freak, right? Like if he was around today, his work wouldn't even get off the ground. He was doing cocaine all night and writing, and it got weird, okay? But he founded psychotherapy, but all of that was theoretical. Do you guys get where I'm coming from? Nobody was looking at the brain. This is all just started. The good news is that you will see different cures for these issues as we move forward. We're only about 30 years into actual research where depression and addiction is concerned. So there's hope. There's absolutely hope. Think about how much research they've done related to cancer and different things that they've come up with. There will be, I don't want to say cures for this issue. I can't think of a different world. There will be different types of treatment than exist today in the next 5 or 10 years. So how do we explain somebody who has both mental health and substance use? One possible explanation is it comes from the same place. Common factor theory. It's caused by the same brain. It's caused by the same part of the brain. That's been kind of challenged through some different mechanisms. If you know anything about depression, one of the prevailing theories is what? It's a depletion of serotonin. So, whereas addiction is depletion of dopamine. So this is challenged, but this is a possible explanation, right? That's not really a problematic explanation either. Here's where it gets problematic. Another explanation is the psychiatric disorder causes the substance use disorder. This is the self-medicating theory. So I was anxious, I was depressed, I started using cocaine, I started smoking weed, I started drinking, it relieved the anxiety. The psychiatric disorder caused the substance use. That's problematic because it would ignore or it would minimize the substance use. So what would happen under the model that currently exists is a person would enter the system, they would focus on mental health, and this part would be kind of ignored. It would be things like just take your medication, see your therapist. The drinking will get better via that part of the process. Does that make sense? So that's problematic. The second one is the substance use causes the depression. My dog ran away, they stole my truck, my wife kicked me out, I'm depressed. And if that's the case, if that's your theory or your position, what are you going to do? You're going to de-emphasize this issue and you're going to focus on go to meetings and stop drinking. Now, here's the problem with these two models. The place that a person enters the system is relatively arbitrary. It depends a lot on the first professional that they see. You guys got that? Tell you a scenario. Here we go. All right, so we're in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and we're at the football game. We're watching the Pittsburgh Steelers dismantle the Cleveland Browns because that's what happens when the Pittsburgh Steelers play the Cleveland Browns. So we're watching, and we're there, we're at the tailgate, and we're drinking all day. We've been drinking since 9 o'clock. We go into the game, we're drinking some more. Game ends, it's a absolutely wonderful game for the Steelers, celebration, doing the thing. This guy, he's never been in treatment before. But he's always, his family's always been a little bit concerned about his drinking. And he's had some in the past where he's been made some veiled suicide threats, but he's never wound up getting help. So he sort of has had these issues floating around in his life, but they've never really gotten that bad. So he gets in his car and he starts to drive home. And he's on the parkway heading to his house, and he gets pulled over by the police and he gets a DUI. Okay? Where does he enter the system? He falls under this. So now he goes, the DUI folks tell him he has to go to, it's called SAP here in South Carolina. You got to go, and you go to group, and in group they tell you got a drinking problem, and they tell you got to quit doing this, and he goes through that, and they don't really talk about the depression. Get your act together. You got a DUI. You follow that? Okay. Same guy, drinking, same scenario, gets in his car, drives home, makes it home, gets to the front door. His wife meets him at the door. Has the baby in her hand, and walks by him, and goes and gets in the van and says, "That's it, I told you, I'm leaving," drives away. He attempts to kill himself, and he winds up in the psychiatric unit. And now we have this. And this gets minimized. And it's as random as it gets, guys. That's the system, the way it exists. And the problem is if you're not educated, and your loved ones aren't educated, once they get into this system, they just ride it out. They just ride it out. And now the good news is a lot of programs now will at the very least kind of point them toward things like AA, or maybe they'll point them towards favor, but they're not comprehensively addressing both issues. Do you guys got that? And I'm telling you, it is that arbitrary on which entry point, which door you get in. Now there's a model that exists in Pittsburgh, in other parts of the country, but Pittsburgh's relatively progressive where behavioral health is concerned. It's called No Wrong Door, which really means it doesn't matter what door you go in, you can get both services. And that's the bi-directional model, which goes like this. It doesn't matter what came first, the chicken or the egg. Each one is making the other one worse. Okay? So if you have a person that you love and they've been diagnosed with both issues, anxiety and marijuana addiction, or depression and alcohol use, or whatever it may be, they need to be getting both services. They need to be trying to access both these doors. There are really no programs in South Carolina that are no wrong door. South Carolina is a very segregated program in terms of mental health or substance use. So, do you guys understand that principle? So let's talk real quick about where you get each one of these things and how you do this. And Meg, I hope this is answering your question. So, substance use. You guys are very familiar with that process. You've gone through it many times with your loved one. You're here, you're learning about it. Your loved one may be even engaging in it. What is it? It could be rehab. It could be favor meetings. It could be AA meetings. It could be Narcotics Anonymous meetings. It could be Celebrate Recovery. It could be seeing a therapist. It could be going to an IOP program for drug and alcohol. You guys, that's pretty familiar. Any questions about the substance use part of that equation? Or comments? Yes?
It still goes back to how do you get...
I'm going to get to that. I promise. She's very concerned that I'm not going to get to that. I swear, I promise. I'm going to get to, this is where, how do you get them to go there? How about this one? We talked a little bit about it already. Carol gave you some information about psychiatrists. Maybe that's the way to think where to start. Can you get a psychiatrist? Also, mental health counselors can help you with this. We have a list of mental health counselors on our website, but I will tell you, hands down, the best resource to get a mental health counselor is the Psychology Today site. Go to Psychology Today. I'm on Psychology Today. You get vetted. It is not like one of these websites where you just pay $200 and you're up there no matter what. They check your license. They check your license number. They even make you write a statement of your philosophy around treatment. So I recommend that over the Favor Greenville site any day of the week. You go in there and you type in your zip code and it'll pop you up like 30, within 30 miles of, and that's where you could find an individual therapist. An individual therapist can't prescribe medication, but an individual therapist can evaluate what the person's dealing with. Now, if you need to do inpatient, that is psychiatric hospitalization. So here it's Carolina Behavioral Health, Marshall Pickens. Any other thoughts or questions about that? Carol?
So if they go to a therapist and get an official diagnosis, can they go to a primary care physician and give him the diagnosis and ask him to prescribe the meds?
They do. People do. Most people do.
But
I don't recommend it necessarily.
If they're messing with the addiction part, the general physicians are afraid of all that now. Very afraid of it.
I could see that happening too. I don't know if you guys could hear the comment. You know, a lot of general physicians are probably going to get squirrely about prescribing medication because we're in a different environment around prescriptions. All prescriptions. Although I got to tell you something, like most of the people that I find that are on medication got it from their GP. That's been my experience when I sit down with people. We have to steer them toward a psychiatrist.
Yeah, I actually had the general practitioner, their office was looking all over Greenville to refer him somewhere, and that's where we run into the trouble, which,
Yeah.
I mean, it's not an issue now, he's gone back to Florida because he couldn't get the services he needed here, but,
Yeah.
you know, it was trouble, it was a problem here.
Very difficult. You have to be very persistent. If you get them into, my thoughts are, if you get them in to see a therapist, because you're going to have more opportunities to get somebody in to see a mental health therapist than you are a psychiatrist.
And he did, he saw some people over in Titusville.
If you do that, then that person is likely to, if it's a good therapist, is likely to help you find other services or at least help you work through it.
This is, I guess, the question for a recovery coach. So you find one, how do you get them to go?
That was her question. I'm about to talk about it. It's the most popular question. It's absolutely true. I'm going to talk about how I mean, there's two issues, right? One is, where should they go? And the second is, will they even go, right?
We had good luck at Greenville Mental Health. She got a good counselor there and then saw a psychiatrist. Now, she was diagnosed previously, but when she went there, I mean, they were good to her.
And you probably had to be patient with that process,
Oh,
am
yeah.
I right? You guys, Greenville Mental Health will see you. They have to, but you're going to have to be patient with that process. There's a waiting list, that kind of thing.
And then I actually got into classes at NAMI, and someone there said, you don't belong here, you belong at Favor.
Yeah. That's good news, because NAMI and Favor have been working closer together, and I think that that's good that we would push people in the right direction along the way. Yes, ma'am.
What is NAMI?
National Alliance of the Mentally Ill, and it's a support. They have support groups here in Greenville if you're dealing with mental illness.
Okay.
If a person's dealing with mental illness. Any other questions?
At NAMI, they have family meeting, which is a great meeting to go and do all of that.
What was the name of the resource you gave initially?
Psychology Today.
Is that a .com? Or?
Just Google it. Psychology Today, and then I'm telling you, that's the way to go, man. Like, my team is obsessed with resources. They've done like 75 resource lists, and I love them for it. But I'm telling you, like, if you're looking for an individual therapist, Psychology Today is the way to go. Now, if you're looking for a rehab, you want to go to our resource list. That's different. If you're looking for a rehab, but if your loved one needs an individual therapist anywhere in the country, guys, Psychology Today is what you want to use. They vet you. Yes.
I'm gonna try again, maybe you'll get to this too later, but, co-occurring disorders, is there a case where the use of the oxy, for example, causes actual chemical, physical changes? My daughter, after doing a lot, wound up finding out that she had 0 estrogen in her body.
So that I would make an argument that pre-existed it. And you could really get into, I don't know if you guys could hear his comment, that she had 0 estrogen. You can really get into holistic medicine where you get a whole entire physical workup. Now that's next level frustration in terms of finding resources. When my daughter went through what she went through, we did the whole nine. Like, we went everywhere. She got a psychiatrist, she got physically evaluated, and she had a cyst on her ovary that was causing progesterone issues that have now been remedied. So
She had a CAT scan and all that, and there weren't any issues with her pituitary, but somewhere along the line, we got the impression that it could be caused by.
no, I've never heard of that before. I've never heard of that before, but it would definitely be an issue, and it would be in an ideal situation you would get all that looked at. I think it's to your question too. All these require appointments. All these require appointments from a willing person. So what you're going to actually wind up doing, guys, is you're going to prioritize. You're going to prioritize. I'm now about to tell you some stuff that I'm probably not supposed to tell you because it's only for clinicians. But I like doing things that I'm not supposed to do. So you want to prioritize. And here's how you prioritize. Okay. Not all co-occurring disorders are created equal. Okay? And this would be if you cannot, find all the resources, right? You can't get the person's only going to go see one therapist, or you can't find a psychiatrist, that kind of thing. Here's what you want to do. All right. You want to conceptualize the co-occurring disorder in one of four ways. Okay. This is how this works. Think of it as four quadrants. Up here in the upper left, you have low mental health, low substance use. Okay. What do I mean by this? This is a person who meets substance use disorder moderate for marijuana. They're smoking marijuana, haven't really been arrested. It's a concern because maybe it's getting away a little bit, but it hasn't really hit DEFCON 5, and they're diagnosed with low-level anxiety. You can get this person involved in either one of those, and they're going to be okay. You got that? Your loved ones are probably more in this category, low mental health. Why can't Favor Greenville have a marker that works? We get all, we're independently funded by philanthropy, and we cannot afford any markers. And so this is supposed to say low mental health, high substance use. Okay? This is probably, a lot of you folks are probably dealing with this. This would be a person who maybe is dealing with some anxiety, but they're still functioning. They can get out of bed, they can go do their thing, but they're drinking a hell of a lot. And you have to prioritize, so where do you prioritize? In the substance use realm. Does that make sense? Now, the reason I'm not supposed to be telling you this is because, it's hard to make a distinction where the person is. I'm just giving you general guidelines that you can go through. The next category down here is high mental health, low substance use. Major depression, can't get out of bed, suicidal thinking, won't eat, hypersomnia, sleeps all day, lack of interest, lack of pleasure. That person needs to start at a psychiatric facility. Got that? And then the next category is high mental health and high substance use. This person, again, you're probably going to be able to start them anywhere, but they're going to need significant services. And in this category, it usually shows up under mental health, because this is usually things like schizophrenia or severe bipolar type 1. These folks are usually showing up in mental health. That, since you have to prioritize, that's how you prioritize to the best of your ability. Now, if you can find somebody who's going to do both, that's ideal. If you can find a facility that's going to do both, and you can afford a facility that's going to do both, that's ideal. How would you know whether or not a person does both? You're probably going to have to ask. They would definitely have to have a psychiatrist on staff if they're a facility that does both. A lot of the treatment programs or the residential programs do not do mental health. They do 12-step based recovery services. And there's really, so you're going to have to figure this out in consultation with us. You got to call. I'm going to make sure to get to. You have to call those numbers, that crisis number, with very specific questions. I'm worried. I think it might be more depression than it is drinking. Here's what's going on. You guys got that? Let me go through real quick some of the ways, or some of the other things. Depression, I just talked about some of the symptoms, right? So that used to be called major depression. It's just depression. There's also a thing called dysthymia, which is a lower level depression, but it's been there forever, okay? The other depression can be discrete periods of time. That's usually treated with an SSRI, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. That's Prozac, Celexa, Lexapro, all those. It's also being treated by some atypicals now, or some different medications. Very hopeful with a medication called Wellbutrin, which acts on the norepinephrine rather than serotonin. So anxiety disorders. Generalized anxiety disorder is basically a free-floating anxiety that's ever present. A panic disorder is about a specific thing. So if I only get anxious and I only have a panic attack when I go outside, that's called agoraphobia. If I'm always nervous, if I'm always worried, if I'm always uncomfortable, that's generalized anxiety disorder. It gets treated with a lot of the SSRIs. Got to be careful, because this also gets treated with what? All the benzos. So that's Xanax, Valium, all that kind of stuff. Bipolar type 1 is the more severe type of bipolar. Bipolar is not mood swings. Somebody with a mood swing is not bipolar. It's two discrete things. One is depression, depressive episodes like I just described, and you also have to have a hypomanic or a manic episode. A manic episode is some of the symptoms. Grandiosity. You guys know what I mean by that? I'm going to Kentucky to buy a thoroughbred horse, and I'm bringing him back to Pittsburgh, and I'm going to start a horse farm. That was one that I dealt with, and he was going to do it. We had to find him, okay? Radically self-defeating behaviors, especially around things like sex, drugs, and money, okay? Money big time. Spending like unbelievable. No sleep at all. Those are some of the symptoms related to that. That usually gets treated with different types of mood stabilizers, Depakote, lithium, that kind of thing. The ADHD is actually a real disorder, guys. It's over-prescribed or over diagnosed, but that would be the stimulants, right? What used to be Ritalin, but now is Adderall. Performance-enhancing drug, that kind of thing. Any other questions about the mental health stuff? All right. How do you get them to go? Okay, so this is the hardest part of the conversation, and this is where, at Favor, we're trying to figure out other ways that we can do this to help you guys, because this is actually where it breaks down for most people. The most honest answer I can tell you is most people can't get them to go. Most people cannot get them to go, and they have to start working through that in their mind and figure out where they want to go from there. What are the factors that will indicate whether or not you can get them go? It's like, how long have you been dealing with this? Younger folks are harder to get to go than maybe older folks. A lot of people have lack of recognition of the problem inside themselves, or an ability to minimize it, justify it in their mind, tell themselves a story around it. Even when it's really bad, people can do that. Everybody here's experienced that, right? You've experienced your loved one explaining to you how this is no big problem. And this is where trying to get clear on where you're at with this process and identifying what you want to do with it. Because my observation, doing this at Favor and doing this, in private practice, working with a lot of families, is many times the family is just not ready to take the steps necessary to get the person to go. And that's okay. That is okay. We do not judge that. We want to be here for you, and we want to help you with that, and we want to listen to you if you're frustrated with that. But we just want to be clear that if the person won't go, there's probably things you're going to have to do dramatically different in terms of your relationship with the person. These are your options. We've gone through this before. If you're dealing with this and you think they need to go and they're not going, your first option is you can do nothing different and you can continue to learn more about this. And we'll help you monitor that. We'll help you work through that in your mind. We'll listen to you as you go through the frustration with that, but we have to acknowledge that a lot of people stay in that column. And like, so for example, my wife stayed in this column for way too long. I was in a car accident. I had a long history of alcohol use disorder before that, also other drugs, kind of whatever came down the pike. I walked out of the emergency room in Western Pennsylvania in 1999 with 120 Darvocet, and within 18 months, my life was completely out of control. It looked very good on the surface. I'd never lost a job, always showed up for work, but at home, she would have been sitting in this room saying, "How do I get him to go?" And she would say things to me like, "You need help. Or if you do that again, you're going to have to leave." And then what? I wouldn't leave, and nothing would happen. Or I'd go to my mom's house and stay there for a while, and she would kind of pat me on the back and tell me how evil my wife was. And I'd be like, "Yes, love my mom." You know? And so, but neither one of them were ready to move out of this column. And there was no way in the world I was ever going to go. Do you guys get that? Yeah. Okay. So the second column is, you can actually have a meeting with your loved one, and I'm going to talk about how to form a team. You can put together a team and have a meeting with your loved one, but it's not an intervention, okay? An intervention involves an ultimatum. This meeting does not involve an ultimatum. It involves, we're very, very concerned. Favorite coaches can talk you through what's called a recovery message on how you frame that up. But it's not an intervention, but you do sit the person down. There's some cons with that. It's tense. It's intense, man. It doesn't feel good. Nobody likes to have those type of conversations. Just uncomfortable, right? But you can do that. And I'm going to talk in a minute about how do you identify the team and how do you go about that. And the third column is you can actually do an intervention. An intervention is a meeting with an ultimatum at the end. You have to be willing to follow through on the ultimatum. So, whereas with the meeting, we're sitting there, we're saying like, "Hey, Rich, here's the deal, man. We're worried about you. We want you to go get help." But we don't say, "And if you don't, here's what's going to happen." With an intervention, you do say that. Now, we recommend you get a professional involved in this. And we're trying to figure out how to get that done. Okay? Any questions about these two? This involves a team of people. The fourth column is you can detach from the situation, and you don't have to confront the person, but you can try to stop rescuing the person. You guys follow that? It's kind of like maybe what you would do over here without the confrontation part. This is what old school, kind of like Al-Anon taught. And it works very well, husband to wife. Works very well, wife to husband, that kind of thing. It's kind of ideal for those situations. It's a little harder parent to child, I've noticed. It's harder for parents to detach from the situation and step back, especially when the kid's young. Why? It breaks your heart. It's, my wife always says you can't divorce your kids, that kind of thing. You know what I mean? It's much harder to detach from a child than it is a spouse. Because you're just going to have a lot of worry and doubt and fear that keeps a lot of people from going in that column. But those are kind of like the four sort of options you have. And as you go through this, now this is if you're dealing with somebody who is actively using and you think they need help, right? This isn't the person who's going to meetings and slips up. That's a whole different deal. If you got your loved one and they're going to meetings and they're doing okay, you don't have to go through all this. You can just simply say, "Hey man, let's get back on track here." You guys get that? This is for the person who's spinning out and not doing anything. I really want to clarify that. If you have somebody that's walking on the recovery pathway, that is different than a person who's not even starting the process. This is to get somebody started. It wouldn't be the same in terms of keeping them going. Here's what we know about keeping people going in recovery. A couple points. If you keep trying in recovery, what do I mean by keep trying? Go to your therapist if you have a therapist. Come to your meetings if you're going to meetings. Whatever it is you're into that's your recovery pathway, if you keep trying, the likelihood of long-term recovery is about 75%, which is pretty good for a chronic disease. Long-term recovery, permanent recovery, however you want to say it. The person gets better. The problem is 9 out of 10 people quit coming. Does that make sense? So the phrase, it works if you work it, is absolutely true. If you do this stuff, but we got to remember that compliance in any behavioral area is hard for human beings. We tend to not do right. You know, our diets, if you look at like compliance with diabetes, it's about 50% non-compliance. So it's not just people with addiction that don't do what they're supposed to do. But I really want to emphasize, if your loved one's on track and they mess up, it doesn't mean you go here. We would recommend in that case, you're literally like lovingly try to push them back on the path as soon as possible. But any questions about this? I'm going to talk about how to build a team in a minute, but those are your options.
If they have all of the above symptoms, how do you know where you start? I mean, like, I know he drank too much. Well, then I have cancer. He was taking my Lortab.
Yeah, so you would start, it would be related to, we would recommend that you would start probably with substance use disorder. You want me to tell you the truth? If you have somebody and it's like equal and you're like all the above, I would start with substance use disorder because of Favor Greenville.
What if they don't live here?
Oh, well, now we have another issue. Where do they live?
Charlotte.
Yeah, so that would be a little harder to find resources there. But you would want to start,
Oncology today, could be.
you would want to start where, in his case, you could probably start in both mental health or substance use. That's another thing. If the person says, I'm going to see a mental health counselor, let's say that happens. I am not addicted. I'm depressed. I'll go see somebody for depression. Why would somebody say that? So you can keep drinking, right? And so you keep taking pills. Because I remember in like 99, when I was getting all spun out on these, I was certain I had mad cow disease. Because that was when it was on TV all the time, and the symptoms were all the same. You stumble into things, you can't talk right, you can never sleep at night, you're irritable. I was like, I got mad cow disease, man. And I was okay with that because it didn't involve admitting that I was addicted to anything. However, what we would say is if the person says, especially if it's a therapist, not a psychiatrist, if the person says to you, I'm depressed but not addicted, I'll go see a mental health counselor, that you jump on it and you push them to a mental health counselor. Because what that does, guys, even though that's not ideal, that's getting them outside of just you talking about it. One of the things that would be important is, can somebody else give the person feedback other than mom or dad? Because you guys know this, I mean, they can shut you out. They can shut you out, they can dismiss what you say, they'll tell you that you're crazy. I don't know if you guys have been told this yet, but like as you approach them and you're worried about them, you're nuts. You are crazy the way that you're looking in my phone. You are crazy with what you're saying. Leave me alone. If you give them a chance and you listen to them, you will believe it. When I got into recovery, ma'am, so my wife was straight pissed whenever I got in. I'm sorry for swearing. My wife was angry when I got into recovery, and the reason was she realized how many times I had manipulated her around this idea of, I don't need help, you need help. Do you follow me? Like, I literally had made her question her own version of reality. I'm here, I want to tell you, as a person in recovery and as a professional doing this, your instincts are right, guys. Your instincts are right. You are the sane one in the equation. Well, relatively speaking. You got what I'm saying? Like you can trust your gut. If you see them doing something and you think they're doing something, I guarantee they're doing something. It's not that, but you want to approach that in a way where, like, what's the purpose of arguing? How do I go about this? Do you follow what I'm saying? I'm not telling you to go on a witch hunt. I'm just telling you your gut is probably correct. All right, so in order to do this or this, you have to have a team. And let's talk about how do you build a team, okay? Because if you're sitting there and you're going through this in your mind, how do you build a team? All right, so here's a way of kind of conceptualizing it. This is me. This is the person with addiction, okay? And we're literally going to build a handbook that has this in it so people can fill this out, okay? So each circle has a certain level of influence. Is this making sense? So you want to get as many people as possible from the closer areas of influence. And there are going to be some people that you absolutely have to have in the equation. So this is sort of mine. This is who wound up getting involved. It was my wife, coworkers, some friends, my boss, my brother-in-law. My kids were not involved, but they certainly fell in that category. You could do the same thing. You could start feeling, and there would be reasons why certain people that are close wouldn't get on your team. What would be an example of a reason that somebody in the first circle still wouldn't get on your team? What would be an example? Well, maybe they don't want to do it. That's definitely one reason. I'm going to talk about that. But they also might be detrimental to the cause. They might be part of the problem. Husband and wife, you want to get the husband involved, but he's a user himself. Does that make sense? You guys will know what this is. Then you got the second level. In my case, it was my mom, my other brothers, some other brother-in-laws, and then out in the outside, some guys I was playing basketball with. Like, you could go deep here. You want to, ideally, you get 4 or 5 people on your team. There's power in numbers. There's power in numbers. The conversation is going to go better if you have 4 or 5 people than if you have just you. If you have just you and you try to do a meeting, that's not a meeting, that's called an argument. Okay? So you want to get other people involved. Who absolutely must be on the team is really important to talk about. There are certain people in your loved one's equation that they must be on the team. In my case, there's no way in the world this gets off the ground unless my wife and my mom are both on the team, even though my mom wasn't in my inner circle. Why? Because I would run to her and she would validate me. Do you follow what I'm saying? So this is part where Favor can coach you through this. And then, the rest of these, you probably could have other people get in there, but you're going to have people with your loved one who have to be on the team. Boyfriend, if they're in a relationship. You can talk about who has the most leverage. Someone from work. Maybe they have a probation officer. I don't know. I understand people wouldn't want to get a PO involved, but if my guy was spinning out or my kid was spinning out and they had a PO, I'm not so sure I wouldn't be contacting them. So this is sort of like what you want to do to kind of conceive where to go with it.
But do you involve the boyfriend and girlfriend if they're a user as well?
You have to ask those questions and work through that. So like in this case, with me, this was, I met my wife through my brother-in-law, Joe, okay? And he was absolutely essential to being involved, but he was a freaking loose cannon. You follow what I'm saying? He didn't have his act together. But he was there because the relationship was strong enough that he had to be there. And this is going to look different for different people. You could actually do it with 3 people if you had to. Technically you could do it with 2, probably, but it would have to be like the 2 most important people. This is back to the question of how do you get them to go. This is where you start. There is no other way to get them to go, guys. There is no certain way you can talk to them. Favor Greenville is considering starting a program where we're going to get a black van and we're going to drive around the city and scoop people up. We're going to call it Ninja Recovery. And you can kind of commission us in the future, but for now, and this would be a way of kind of conceiving it as you go through it. Now, I want to talk a little bit real quick about how to pick this team and how to think it through. Yes, sir.
Rich, as far as putting the team together, we have a situation with my son, and obviously I couldn't do anything, my wife couldn't do anything, and we got him a counselor at Favor, and that got him into treatment. That made happen something.
So I don't know if you guys hear what Bob's saying. So you would not be falling into this, Bob, because he had a counselor. Do you follow what I'm saying? If the person has a counselor, or if the person's involved in programs, your approach is completely different. You go through the counselor. Do you guys get that? Or maybe like you work on you wait for the program to work its magic. This is if the person isn't doing anything. So somehow you got him to come see Mike. Probably because you had a conversation with him. You guys get that? Like sometimes this will go down a lot easier than y'all think. They might respond to, hey Rich, I'm worried about you. Why don't you go check this guy out?
And I didn't have to explain why or say, get in an argument. It was just a very low-key, consensual.
It's an interesting thing to say, and it's an interesting thing to think about. I think one of the other things is we sometimes assume that the person's automatically going to go off and push back, because that does happen, and that's very noteworthy when it happens. But I've had a lot of experiences where I've had a lot of interventions, guys, where literally the intervention has been so non-eventful and easy that I wanted to say, wait. Can we all just at least say what we rehearsed yesterday? And I used to get criticized by my supervisor because she would say, because we used to have to turn in these tapes and stuff and get our interventions approved. And she would say, your problem is you talk too much. And when you make the sale, shut up. Because I was almost like, this is too easy. Now, I will tell you though, you might be able to predict where your loved one's at, and there are some certain factors that come into that. One of the things that stands out to me are young people. Young people, in their 20s, for example, tend to have a little bit more pushback than, I don't know how old your son was.
22.
But he went.
But he related to Mike, and Mike gained his trust.
Yeah.
In fact, he told me early on he would tell Mike anything or talk to Mike about anything.
But you still have to get him in the door.
Right.
You still have to get him in the door. And this is the problem we have. How do we get him in the door? So, real quick around building your team and working through this issue. All right, so this convoluted thing is called a genogram or a genogram, depending on who you talk to. And it's a version of a family tree that's used by therapists and interventionists to guide families through selecting who should be involved. Okay? And now you don't have to do it this way. You would do this if you did it with a professional. You could do this in your mind. You could do it with a piece of paper. You could just start writing people down. But this was literally my situation whenever we were dealing with this. And I'm going to tell you something right off the bat. I don't know if you noticed that my dad was not included in it. And he wasn't even on the list as a candidate. And that's because we were exceedingly estranged. He was still dealing with his stuff. There was just a divorce that had just occurred. He would not have been a candidate for this process, even though he was my father. Make sense? If you go through this is the whole crew. My brothers, we grew up, in a house where alcoholism was present, and we were all kind of like every man for themselves. Kind of decision that we weren't really close enough to go there. But my brother-in-law was. Does that make sense? That kind of thing. My kids. The other part about this these are my grandparents. And so there's an issue around when you talk to your loved one. And we're going to teach the team to do this starting on Thursday, the folks that are going to be trained as our interventionists. But if you can take the focus off your loved one and put it on to, this is a disease, this is a process, this is something that we need to recover from as a family, you can get a lot of mileage out of that. You take the focus off of you evil, no good, junkie, and you put it on to, this is something we've been dealing with for a long time in our family, and we want to help you get through this. It's called recovery messaging. And one of the ways you do that is through your family narrative, through your family story. And here's what we know. We know that most families have a history of trauma in it. And we know where addiction is concerned, it was usually triggered around trauma, multi-generational trauma. And so my family, it starts right here with my grandfather, who, when he was 8 years old, his mom died, okay? Back then, you immediately remarried. That's how you got it done, right? You had to have somebody to help raise your kids. She was evil. He lived in a freaking shed in the backyard. She beat him mercilessly. He started drinking at 12 to deal with it. You see, This is where it starts. This is where, what? The genetic factors start to come in. Do you blame my grandfather for drinking when he was 12, when he was going through this? I don't. I would have, at that point, it's a survival mechanism. He quits school when he's 14, starts buying up land in western Pennsylvania, winds up being one of the most successful timber guys in western Pennsylvania. And to this day, we're still reaping the benefits of this. We all own land in western PA, but he becomes an alcoholic. Has an incident when he's like 30 years old and just stops drinking. Doesn't go to AA, he blacks out, and he just stops, okay? Now, go down here. This is my mom. My mom has 12 brothers and sisters. Okay? That's what everyone says. That's back in the day, that's kind of how you rolled a little bit, right? 9 of them have an issue. Okay? You don't have to tell me it runs in families. Then it gets down to me. And so the idea would be, if you were doing this on me, it would be, if I was doing this on me, which is, or someone like me, I would literally put this on the board as the therapist and say, what you're doing is, you're a hero. You are a hero because you are changing the trajectory of this family. Not because anybody's bad, but because this happened, and it organized everything at that point forward. From that point forward, it was the only way to survive. Now, this is hard to do, guys, in our world, because this doesn't stack up right with everything that you've been told about people who are addicted. Because what have you been told about people who are addicted? What's the media tell you? You know what? Well, they have a choice, and really they're just sort of like liars, cheaters, and thieves, and every time they open their mouth, and, you know, how do you know if an alcoholic's lying? Well, he's talking. What's the difference between an alcoholic and a drug addict? An alcoholic will steal your phone, a drug addict will steal your phone and help you look for it. So, you know, you're trying to work through this from a more compassionate point of view. You're not going to do this as a family member because your level would be free. But you can talk about it differently. You can start to work this idea that we want you to get better, and we're also willing to become part of the solution. You guys are already here at a group, but a lot of times it would be we're willing to go to a group, we're willing to go to a therapist ourselves. So that's kind of, and that ultimately, in whatever form it takes on, that team, what we believe that does is it starts to put pressure on the individual. And, you know, now obviously if you go to the ultimatum, to your question also, sir, like what do we do? If you go to the ultimatum, you're now like, really, this is it. This is the day we're going to go in and we're going to say you can no longer live here unless you go to rehab or whatever it might be.
Well, like in my case, my older son went and talked to him, and he said, he figured it out real fast. He said, Mom made you do this. And he said, Mom has cancer. She's not worried about cancer, but she's worried about you.
Well, that's a good place to start. I don't know if you guys can hear that.
Yeah, he behaved the next time we saw him.
Yeah.
You know.
What you also want to do is try to get clear on what do you want the person to do. You know what I mean? Like, so Bob shared about his son coming and seeing Mike. You want to go into the conversation. You can compromise. You might want to go into the conversation with rehab, but the person's willing to do 90 meetings in 90 days, for example. But you want in your mind at least have, like, what do I want them to do? You guys get that? You're going to have to come up with that. Because if you just go to them and say, you know, do something, they're going to, hey, I just found this new, like, marijuana program. I signed up for it yesterday. That was a joke, guys. There is no such thing. All right. So let's talk.
There's nothing wrong with that, either.
What's that?
He doesn't think there's anything wrong with that.
No, most people don't. Do you guys? No, a lot of people don't. Do you guys get that team thing? So Thursday evening at 4 o'clock, 10, 15 brave souls have signed up to enroll in this class. And so what we anticipate being able to do is create an arm of favor that will be specializing in this. There will be a minimal cost for these services. And the reason is we cannot do this for free because what happens is people sign up for it and they don't show up. You're going to have skin in the game to get our help with this, okay? and it will be specializing, and that's the only reason we're doing it, guys. The only reason we're doing it is because we've had so many experiences with, yep, I'm ready to do an intervention, and then we do the prep, and we go to the intervention, and it comes time for mom to say, and if you don't go to rehab, you're gonna have to leave. And she says, well, I'm really not sure I want to do, and that's not going to work, right? So this will be a way of grabbing a hold of the level of commitment. And so what we hope to have happen is help guide you through this process, because this question of how do we get them to come, it's hands down the biggest question, right? If there's staff in here, they know it. It's hands down the biggest problem. How do we get them to go? All right, so let's talk about what you guys are going through and hit on some topics related to that. We talked a little bit. This is all the stuff that we've talked about in here. Caregiver stress, PTSD, acute stress, emotional and physical toll of caregiving. Women are more at risk. If you're living with the person that you're caring for, you're more at risk. Isolation and depression. Does that stuff make sense? Some additional signs. Weight is up and down, sadness, unusual sleep patterns. You start to get high and get drunk yourself. Overwhelmed, loss of interest, inability to make decisions. You feel like you're squeezed, like your life is being squeezed. You're unable to live your life. Does this make sense? This is actually from the University of Tennessee's Alzheimer's Caregivers Group. I fooled you, didn't I? But the point with this is, everybody knows when you're dealing with Alzheimer's, it's a full-time job. Okay? This is a full-time job too. And so taking care of yourself and trying to figure out a way that you don't succumb to this depression, that you don't succumb to this anxiety, is just as important as figuring out how do you get them to go to a meeting. I mean, we can discuss that, but it is. How can you? Your loved one doesn't stand a chance if you go down with the ship. And the idea would be you will go down with the ship because no one's superhuman. No one can take that level, depending on what you're actually dealing with right this minute. Most people can't take that level of stress, anxiety, and worry without it having some kind of major impact on their life. And even if you look outside of these chronic diseases, about 33% of Americans report that they're overstressed and overwhelmed and losing it. But we don't talk about it, right? We don't. Why don't we talk about it? What's, this room, you guys are here. But this isn't everybody in Greenville that should be here, right? Right. What gets in the way of seeking therapy or seeking help? Mostly embarrassment and shame, right? Maybe money in some cases, maybe accessibility in certain cases, but I would make an argument most of the time I really don't want to be like, I'm not crazy, man. I don't want to be identified that way. We would encourage you to think beyond that. We would encourage you to think that it's no different than if you had a physical disease and you went to the doctor. Because some folks, you might need something more than what we're giving. That's possible too, right? You might need an individual therapist who specializes in depression. You might need to see somebody, just like your loved one might need to see somebody. We're going to talk about some of the things that we do in terms of getting through this. I think we talked about that. Did we talk about be careful what you allow in? All the studies that are out there around what they call the new media and how incidences of anxiety and depression have escalated. It's like a hockey stick since the advent of the internet and since accessibility on social media and just this sort of like the world is ending kind of vibe, even though we live in the safest period of time in human history. More people will die from sugar than war in America. It used to be 3 things killed us. War, disease, and starvation. And that's even as recently as 200, 250 years ago. We're probably okay from a physical health standpoint, but if you watch the news, you wouldn't necessarily think that. So the first piece of advice is start to try to think about this person who I was consulting with developed an app, and a feature on the app is what he calls it the beautiful web. And what he has done is he created an algorithm that will not allow you to access negativity. Now, between me and you, it's kind of extreme, because really all you get are like puppies, kittens, and rainbows. So I'm not sure it's actually going to work. But do you get the idea behind it? It's kind of like a filter. You guys agree with that? So that's one step. We talked about the happiness formula last week. 40% is up to you. How many people practice mindfulness, practice breathing exercises? So this is one of those exercises that won't work unless you do it. Breathing exercises will not help you unless you breathe. A lot of people have doubts about this type of stuff, but breathing exercises have been shown to demonstrate a physical health benefit in terms of lowering your parasympathetic nervous system, bring down your level of emotional arousal, clear your head. This is a simple exercise, and you can get an app. Before we even talk about that, one of the things that I recommend is what I use is called Headspace. You download an app on your phone. You get the first 10 days free, and then after that it's like $4.99 or something like that. And it takes you through a 10-minute guided meditation. And you just sit and you do the best you can with it, and you go through and you commit to like an everyday practice in that area. Again, this is hard if you're dealing with something right this minute. This might be hard to wrap your mind around. You may be sitting there saying, like, how can this help the situation? How will this help my loved one? How can I get him better by doing this? This isn't about getting him better. It's about getting you better. We talked about worry last week. Some of the techniques around worry. Give yourself 20 minutes a day set aside for worry. Try to tell yourself that I'll get to that at 7 o'clock. Some people would say you write in a journal at that time. I don't know if you do that, but you're basically trying to pull yourself back from this constant rumination of the issue. Can anyone relate to that? How many people feel like they worry all day about their loved one? Right? I mean, like literally, like almost all day. As if it never leaves your mind. We started a program where we're trying to help corporations identify and work through like lost productivity. It's about $480 billion in lost productivity related to substance use disorders. And the majority of it is not the person with the substance use disorder. The majority of it is the person in accounting who's just sitting there. They're supposed to be entering payroll or doing whatever, and what are they actually doing? They're thinking about what's going on with Johnny. Then they're going out in the hall and they're making phone calls to whomever. So trying to be able to step back. These are also just some exercises. People will say, ask yourself those 4 questions. Is it unlikely? Is it unimportant? Is it uncertain? Is it uncontrollable? For you guys, the main one would be uncontrollable. If it's any of those 4, you're supposed to let go. Again, easier said than done. Easier said than done. And then one of the other very, very solid things is distracting yourself. If you feel like you're caught in that cycle, find something else to do. Anybody have anything that they do whenever they're chronically worried or they're in the middle of that beast? Prayer is very, very common. It's and I was told this when I was in early recovery, because one of the things, you get into early recovery, and I got recovery through 12-step programs, through pretty, I guess you would call it a fundamentalist 12-step program, and it was literally like pray on your knees in the morning, pray on your knees at night, and pray throughout the day when you were having thoughts. And I remember I was kind of like, I'm not sure where I feel about this higher power thing. I was going through that stuff, and basically the person who was working with me said you can't have 2 competing thoughts in your head at one time. So even if you don't believe in the power of prayer, believe in the power of distracting yourself with prayer. Does that make sense? I believe in the power of prayer, but if you don't, if you start with, even if it's a rote prayer, you're now moving away from the worry cycle. I think we talked about this. Find something fun to do. How many people have done something fun this last week? Wow. You guys are out of control. Get engaged in an activity. If you're not doing anything for yourself, find a hobby. Get involved in something that really, really captures your spirit and captures your attention. Focus on relationships, quality over quantity, this whole meaning idea. How do you reconcile suffering? How do you reconcile your loved one dealing with a chronic disease? What's your approach with that? And then, of course, attitude or achievement, get some wins in your life. These 5 areas tend to add up to healthier outlook on life. This idea of flow or finding your zone, okay, when you're completely engaged in an activity and time flies by. I wanted to talk a little bit more about that tonight. This has been proven. So one of the things that I've been really, really into, how many people have heard the term biohacking? Okay, good. It's basically examining human beings, if you will, their physiology and their psychology, and trying to find different techniques, different things. Now, a lot of these don't apply to me because there's some, how do I want to say this, mood or mind-altering things that I've decided I'm not going to hack for obvious reasons. But what can you do that increases your level of happiness or contentment? And what's interesting about flow is that there's like an afterglow, literally, after you have a flow experience. For up to 2 or 3 days later, you will feel the positive effects of being immersed in an activity. How do you find out what that is? You have to know yourself. You have to know what, like, so for me, for example, doing an art project would not access this. Knitting would not access that. Woodwork, but you have to know yourself well enough to think back in your life, like, what was it that really set you on fire and really, really engaged you, and try to access that during the week or once a month, or make a commitment for yourself. If you feel like you can't figure it out, then you got to start trying different things. A lot of people will get into maybe sports or different activities that they haven't ever tried before. You hear people talk about running can become almost like a flow state where you're completely caught up in the activity in the moment. I think we have, let me see here. This website, www.flowgenomeproject.com, you can answer a series of questions that will kick back recommendations for you to try. If you're going through a personality quiz, it's very similar to that. It'll kick back, give this a shot, give that a shot, that kind of thing. This was my profile. It's basically telling me to go surf and skydive. Flow hacks. Hard chargers gravitate toward adventure sports: skiing, snowboarding, surfing, skydiving, mountain biking, freaking A. It's telling me to go cage fight. So that would be, so you would want to access something that sort of for me, I have to access something that's high energy. It goes on to say, what's interesting, it goes on to say, be careful, if this is your profile, you're extra vulnerable for addiction. Because you're a thrill seeker.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
I just wanted to get that.
There, get that right there. So, if any of this is going to work, you have to try to apply it in your life. You have to really try to put some time into taking care of yourself. Put some time into actually trying to tune up your life. You're going to get a chance to take care of your loved one. You're going to get a chance to intervene. You're going to get a chance to put together a team meeting. It might take time to get there. I completely can relate to the fear around that and the anxiety around that, but taking time to take care of yourself is also important. All right, a couple other things. This idea of cataloging positive behaviors. People have been doing it for decades, for years. Scrapbooks are part of that. Collecting pictures are part of that. Journaling can be part of that. Take a minute right now and just sort of sit there and try to think about a place you've gone, or a trip you've gone on, or a person that you were with, or an activity you were involved with, where you were just you had an absolute blast. An absolute blast. Or your favorite place in the world. Or your favorite vacation spot. This is all part of this process. Because what happens, guys, is we get tuned into the bad stuff. We are very good at noticing what's negative in life. We're hardwired that way because it kept us alive. All of us in this room are hardwired that way. Why? Because we've dealt with things with our families. So you're even more aware of the negative. But that can eat away at you. Have you ever been around somebody who was always like the cup was half empty? Like everything sucks? Have you ever been around that person? It sucks away your energy. It's like an emotional drain. It's an emotional vampire. Beautiful day today. Ah, it's too hot. You know, I heard it's going to snow this weekend. It's too cold. Right? It'll never get better. Now, some of that can be a person's personality, and you can handle that to a certain degree if you have to. But the idea would be, well, how do you balance that out? So cataloging. Now we have phones where we can... See, I was just looking for my phone. I do that all the time. It's so weird. So you can go through your phone. I'll be up here. I'll be like, I lost my phone. And it's right there. But you have pictures in your phone. You almost have a scrapbook with you all the time. You know, you put pictures of your pets in there. Put pictures of your kids in there. Look through it periodically. And you can invent your own ways to catalog positive events. You can think of your own ways to get through that. You know, now some negative emotions serve a purpose, right? So it's not like I'm sitting here and telling you that you're never going to feel bad again, because that wouldn't be good either. Negative emotions can get you into gear. It's not about not being worried about your loved one. It's not about not being concerned. It's about not being overly concerned or being consumed with worry. I want to make sure that we're clear on this. There's a psychological term called, it goes like this: affect appropriate to situation. And that means you're worried and you should be worried. That means you're angry and you should be angry. You're sad and you should be sad. The problem is what? It gets out of control. How do you know if it's getting out of control? What would be your vulnerability? You ask yourself those questions. How would your loved ones know if it was getting out of control? Examples would be folks would move from like I'm sad to like I'm depressed. And maybe they can't get out of bed. Maybe they're tearful all day. I will tell you, if you're dealing with if you're dealing with a situation where parents are concerned about kids, it'll show up a lot in fighting between the parents. Does that make sense? You're asking yourself, it's not that I'm not supposed to feel bad, I don't want it interfering with my life. Any questions about that or thoughts? How do you deal with that if that's the case? What if you're sitting here right now and you're saying like, well, I'm worried that might be happening. Anybody have any suggestions on how to deal with that? Yes.
Right after Thanksgiving, my son had a crisis, and he binged, and I called Mike Baker, and it took 6 weeks to get an appointment. He got an appointment, he went and saw him, liked him, felt good. That was 10 days ago. And tonight, just a few minutes ago, I got a phone call that he's relapsed.
So let's talk about that particular incident. There's no way in the world, and everybody in the room, you know, you've all gone through some version. There's no way in the world that that's not going to make you sad and worried and angry. Do you guys get that? Like if she were sitting there right now saying, I'm good to go, that would be more concerning than being upset. So the issue is let's just start with how do you rebound from that, or how do you get through it? What's going to happen is, and you know this, you've gone through, you're going to like triage the situation. You're going to get additional information when you leave here. You may wind up calling Mike. You may wind up calling the crisis line. You may wind up, he may wind up getting right back on track. There's all kinds of stuff you don't know yet.
He has another appointment in a week.
So he has another appointment. Maybe you ask him to get to these meetings. You're going to do things along the way here.
I saw him today and asked him to come tonight. He seemed to be agitated about something or worried, and I just had this feeling.
and you guys tell me if you can relate to this. So when you get the call like that, what tends to happen, ma'am, is you're actually going to like go into gear here now, and you're going to start to try to figure some stuff out. And then what's going to go down is one way or the other, he'll either get back on track, or you won't be quite as high because you kind of like be like, here we go again. And you'll go from being in that crisis, kind of let me solve the problem, and you'll come down a little bit. And that's actually when the danger is. That's actually when the danger is. Because you guys handle yourselves in crisis. You're actually pretty good in a crisis. You're actually less likely to suffer a mental health crisis yourself when you're in the middle of the crisis. Because why? You're engaged in solving the problem. The issue usually comes a couple days later or a week later. And that's whenever you got to watch out that it doesn't hit you through, depression. And you'll know, guys, because it'll lay you out. You won't be able to do anything.
So should I call Mike tomorrow?
I would call Mike. I would also, and everyone should make sure you can kind of like get with him, see where he's at. You can call for additional advice to us. You should get our meeting schedule. Sounds like you already have this. You probably have already started some of the right conversations around this. Okay, so sort of trust yourself too. That's the other thing. In most of these cases, guys, you actually know the answers. You know that you got to try to what? Get him right back on the wagon.
Yeah, well, I'm gonna leave here tonight and go straight to where he is and see how bad it is.
Yeah,
So I
so
can talk to him.
So, and what you'll do is, as time goes by through this process, you'll figure out like what your plan is to these responses. She's going to go try to figure out what's going on. Another option for her, and this isn't where you're at right now, he just started therapy, but you could also respond to that by doing what? Not responding at all. It depends on the situation, but my point with the whole thing is after you kind of like do what you can with it, try to make sure that you're taking care of yourself by coming back to this group, by talking to people you have that are supportive to you. Talking to people you have that are supportive, it can be folks that favor, but it can also be friends. It has to be somebody, though, that's not going to be judgmental and knows a little bit about this. And then as you take care of yourself, you're able to rebound from these situations much, much quicker, which makes it more likely what? That you'll be able to respond however you can to help your loved one, but that you're going to be okay in the long term. So your response in being upset, you should be upset. It's the idea of let's make sure it doesn't turn into anything other than that. Relapse is part of, it's always hard to say this in the right way because you don't ever want to make excuse for somebody's relapse because the worst can happen when people relapse. But people do slip up. It doesn't mean it's not going to work. People make mistakes. Actually, most people slip and fall before it sticks and stays. Does that make sense? It's hard to say that because people will say, there's this idea that a person hears you say that and they're like, oh, okay, get out of jail free card, right? And I know that if I went out drinking tonight after this family recovery meeting as the CEO of Favor, that's pretty weird. But anyway, if I went and did that and I went home and my wife met me at the door and I said, relapse is part of recovery, she would probably stick a fork in my neck. It's not meant to be an excuse. It's not meant to be an excuse. I'm saying it for your benefit, not for his. Yes?
She might want to take somebody with her.
Well, I mean, that's completely up to her. A lot of times it depends on the situation.
He's 42, I've been doing this for 25 years.
Yeah. So, where you would want to go, ma'am, is you would want to start, you're going to go through this and then you would want to start to ask questions about if this is going to happen again, how do I respond the next time? And the idea would be try to do something different the next time. You guys, people get used to responses. They get used to, here's what I do, here's what you do as my loved one. So one of the things would be from here, let me figure out a different deal if this happens again. Let me figure out how I'm going to respond differently. Does that make sense to everyone? Those are the little things that you can do. Yes?
It's like when our son is home, we're walking on eggshells.
Yes.
You never know when he's going to fly off the handle. You wouldn't act the way he treats us, at work or any other situation.
Yeah.
Do you call him on that?
Yeah, you call them on that, and next week we're going to talk about boundaries. We're going to talk about how you call them on that. And you call, if people are treating you bad, you call them on it. It's not okay. It is not okay. And how do you call them on that depends on the particulars of the situation. I mean, I would not allow them to come down. I'd be like, stay out of my face. Come down whenever you're sober. That kind of thing.
Well, he drinks when he's home.
Well, then I would maybe not have him down at all. Then, I don't do that. Like, guys, I'm not trying to tell you exactly what to do. The details are very important. What I am telling you is, just because it's a disorder of the brain doesn't make it okay for people to mistreat you. It is not okay, and especially if they're grown. Especially if they're grown, one of the best things you can do if you got a 40-something-year-old or whatever it might be, is to really start thinking about, I'm going to stop rescuing this situation. I'm going to let the chips fall where they may, or however that looks, because it's been going on probably way too long. There's a huge difference between a 22-year-old and a 42-year-old. It took too long for me, guys. I was 31. They should have tightened the screws on me way before that. Now I'm scared to death of both of them. So, all right. We will, next week, we will talk specifically about how do you identify what the boundary is, whether or not he should be in the house at all. I'm just using this as an example. And then how do you implement that? How does that feel, and how do you deal with the fear and the anxiety around starting to make those changes? In the meantime, make sure that you're talking to whoever you need to talk to and taking care of yourself so you don't lose your mind along the way with this process, guys. Don't go down with the ship. I don't have the cards, but if Carol, can you help me out and grab the crisis cards? Carol's going to grab the on-call cards. So here's how this works. Favor Greenville has 18 paid staff, okay? Part-time mainly, 6 or 7 full-time. Trained by me, supervised by me, the same philosophy and certified by me. When you call them, they're speaking for me. Does that make sense? I used to be able to do all this, guys. When we first opened, it was literally my phone number. I was the only one making the pizzas. Okay? We've expanded our locations. We've expanded to about 23 sites here in Greenville, a site in Anderson, a site in Spartanburg. We've brought highly competent and trained people on board. So trust those folks. Tomorrow morning at 10:30, I will be meeting with them for an hour and a half and reviewing cases and talking about situations. And so trust that process if you have specific questions about what you're dealing with. Okay? And we'll leave these cards up here, and you can grab those. So if we can get a moment, guys, we're going to say a prayer, say the Serenity Prayer for those still suffering with this disease and for the family members brought into this no choice of their own, followed by the Serenity Prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. All right, you're free to go forward and save the world, change the world, bring serenity to everybody, whatever it is. All right, man. By the time this time of the day, I don't even know what I'm saying half the time. Like I'm literally like almost completely like brain dead, man.